I think a few more people might be joining us, but they might have to miss the housekeeping. Kilias Kakiri, Kalimerasas, and many thanks to everyone joining us tonight. So before we start, some of the housekeeping. Tonight's event will run until around 8 o'clock UK time, with the last 20 minutes for a Q&A. You can type questions into the Q&A box on the bar at the bottom of your screen during your talk, and it might be hidden, but if you navigate your cursor down to the bottom, it's the box with 2 speech bubbles that says Q&A. You can like or upvote any questions you agree with that come up in the Q&A, and I'll take note of these and field the most popular ones to the speaker during the Q&A session. I'd also like to thank Fiona Hara for setting up tonight's Zoom webinar and remind everyone that the talk is being recorded. Onto the introductions. Tonight's talk is jointly hosted by the Hellenic Society and the Hellenic Centre, which celebrated its 25-year anniversary in 2019. 2020 is also a year of anniversaries, marking the 2,500th year since the battles of Salamis and Thermopylae. Here to tell us more about the Battle of Salamis, our speaker tonight needs very little introduction. Paul Cartledge is A.G. Leventis Senior Research Fellow at Clare College, Cambridge, Emeritus A.G. Leventis Professor of Greek Culture at the University of Cambridge, and Honorary Keeper of the Fitzwilliam Museum's Department of Antiquities. He is an Honorary Citizen of Sparti, holds the Gold Cross of the Order of Honour awarded by the President of the Hellenic Republic, and has written copious works on ancient Greek history and society. His recent books include Democracy, A Life, and Thebes, the Forgotten City of Ancient Greece. Over to you, Paul.
Yassas, Kalisperas to everybody from Trumpington in South Cambridge. Let me begin with some heartfelt thanks. Above all, 5. First, to James, our Themistocles, since he's grown a rather lovely beard, for being our host this evening. It's not an easy thing. I fortunately can see him or an image of him. Sadly, I can't see any of you. You can see just a small image of me. Secondly, to Anastasia Christofilipoulou of the Fitzwilliam Museum, but for whom you would have had just to listen to me, you would not see the slideshow, which she prepared for me. Thirdly, of course, to the Hellenic Society, to its council, and especially its wonderful secretary, Dr. Fiona Hara. It's a great honour for me to be the Society's current president and to be giving this talk as my first public act as president. Fourthly, huge thanks, Efharistumi Parappa, to our co-sponsor this evening, the Hellenic Centre of London, and its superb director, Mrs. Agatha Kalisperas. A special Kalispera to you, Agatha. Thanks finally to the few, and I don't mean just the few of you who have had the wise decision made to tune in now, but to the few, capital T, capital F, of Winston Churchill's speech delivered in 1940, because this, the time I'm speaking to you, is pretty much the 80th anniversary of what we call, in retrospect, the Battle of Britain. And a very well-regarded author has spoken of that. Upon the outcome of the air battle depended the future of democratic Europe. So that gives the democratic keynote that I want to stress, because I'm now going to make, before I start the main lecture, a couple of spoiler alerts. First of all, speaking very strictly, 2020 is not the 2,500th anniversary of the battles of Thermopylae and Salamis. That will fall in 2021. It's complicated. It's all to do with BC and AD. 2021, a year which for many of us will also be the 200th anniversary, the bicentenary of the Greek Epanastasis, the rising in 1821 against the Ottoman Turkocratia. But of course, some of my Maniot friends down in the south of Laconia They don't believe their ancestors were ever under the yoke of a Turkish Kratos. But that's another story, Ali story for another time. Second spoiler alert, and it's about my take on tonight's subject. Yes, it's about Salamis, the Battle of Salamis, but it's not going to include a blow-by-blow description, where possible, of the actual naval battle in the Strait in September 480 BC or BCE. For that, I refer you to such great works as those of my good friends Barry Strauss and William Shepherd.
Sorry to jump in, Paul. A few people are saying there's some rustling coming over on the audio.
Yes, well, that's just the paper. That's the end of that. Apologies for that. There's no way, if you have a text, and that's my only text, it's very difficult not to move it because it's off to the side of the screen.
Okay.
Now, the rest that follows is entirely without a text. Thank you very much, those listeners, and I do apologize for that. That's just one of the costs of this, well, I don't know, in a way it's wonderful, in a way it's dreadful, Zoom communication, telecommunication. So, James, if I may, I'm going to now move on to the first slide. So I'm going to begin, as it were, at the end with Demokratia in the 330s BC, BCE, with a stele, which represents one of the ways in which the Athenian democracy did democracy, very, very differently from our own. This is direct democracy. It is the kratos, the power, force, might of the mass of the citizen, that is adult male citizen people. And in one of its constructions, democracy is not such a pleasant term. It doesn't only mean government of the people, by the people, for the people, but also government by the masses over the elite few, by the democrats against the local oligarchs. But I'm not going to explore that class dimension in its antagonistic form in this lecture. I want to accentuate the positive. So in the topmost portion of this stele, made of Pentelic marble, is a relief. And though many Athenians probably couldn't read, I think actually most of them could both read and write, but many couldn't read. They could all see, unless they were, of course, blind. And in this image, you have a representation of what Demokratia is and meant in the 330s. Seated is a idealized representation of the demos, the people. Middle-aged, interestingly, not a young man in the full flush of youth, full-bearded and buff. He's stripped. You can see his torso. He's wearing a cloak. Behind him stands a fully clothed, demure, adult female. And she is taken to be, and I think rightly to be, a personification of democracy itself, Demokratia. She is in fact a goddess, and we know the Athenians worshipped Demokratia. I don't think many of us see our form of representative Demokratia in quite the same way as they did. Why was this stele put up, and why was it put up when it was? In 336 BC, the Athenians, together with their then Theban allies, had recently lost a very major battle to the Macedonians under King Philip and his 18-year-old son, Alexander, later Alexander the Great. Macedon was an autocracy. It was, if you were a democrat, a tyranny. The Athenians were terrified, most of them, that they would suffer what had been the fate of Thebes and other cities, the imposition of a Macedonian garrison, the removal of their existing democracy, and its replacement with something other than democracy, either oligarchy or tyranny. And so they pass a law proposed by a man called Eucrates, nomen omen, he who is well in relation to Kratos, to say that if anybody kills any Athenian citizen, a man who they genuinely and reasonably believe to be aiming to become just that tyrant, in the Macedonians' interest, they may kill him with impunity. So in other words, that homicide would be deemed to be an act of patriotic fervor. So that's at the end of the democracy story. I'm now going to take you back to the very beginning of it, to a statue group. Of course, what you're looking at here in marble, not bronze, in a copy made in the Roman imperial era, and that's why it's now in the Naples Archaeological Museum, of two, as the Athenians retrospectively saw them, freedom fighters, Harmodius, Aristogeiton being the older on the left, Harmodius on the right. We don't exactly know how they were posed. This is one possibility. The original bronze statues were nicked by a certain Xerxes, Persian emperor, when he invaded Greece, and this is of course our main story, but not the only part of our story, some 20 to 25 years later. It was replaced by another bronze original in the 470s, and that is the original of which this is a copy. But I'm more interested in why the Athenians took these two aristocratic lovers to be their, in some sense, liberating founding fathers, when, as Thucydides, not a Democrat, rather acidly pointed out, they hadn't killed any tyrant, they killed the tyrant's younger brother. They were lovers, and they were involved in a lover's tiff, which of course had political implications, but they were not primarily motivated by the political good of Athens in terms of democracy. And actually the first democracy in any sense, not yet called that the Athenians were to get, did not come for about half a dozen years after this deed of certainly political assassination, but not strictly speaking tyrannicide. How boring to be so pedantically accurate. But the really important point is this: the myth of the tyrannicides became the founding myth, the charter, if you like, of Athenian democracy. And it was a purely Athenian story, and that's why they emphasized it so much. And so the key thing in terms of ideology is that the Athenians saw democracy, demokratia, in one of its most important significations as the antithesis, the antithesis of tyranny. Tyranny bad, democracy fantastic. So this is just to show you another version of that statue group in Naples in a different medium, in plaster cast. And it's, as you see, in our, that is Cambridge's Museum of Classical Archaeology cast gallery. And when things get a bit easier for moving around, I do hope you'll all come to Cambridge and visit the Museum of Classical Archaeology. I'm moving ahead quite fast because, as James said, we want to leave time for Q&A, and I shall aim to speak for something like 40 minutes. So that will take us to something like 8:15 in UK BST. So we have to put Xerxes, I mentioned him already, and his massive amphibious invasion, in fact, the largest amphibious invasion of Europe before the D-Day landings of June the 6th and following 1944. And so what we're looking at is a rather beautiful, we call it a treasury, though just to how much, just to what extent it contained lots and lots of treasures is another issue. But it's without question Athenian. And it's at Delphi, what the Greeks called the navel of the world. It's a pan-Hellenic, oracular sanctuary, sort of place where you go, not only if you want to consult the Delphic oracle, but you want to be, to prove that you are, to experience the quite rare, actually, feeling of being Greek altogether. Greeks, of course, didn't call themselves Greeks. We owe the word Graiki, Greeks, to the pesky Romans, but they called themselves Hellenes. And so the spirit in which they would foregather in Delphi would be a pan-Hellenic spirit. And this is wonderfully located. If you go to Delphi and you walk up the sacred way, eventually to the Temple of Apollo, and then if you go beyond it, up further to the theatre, and then up further still, you come to the Stadion, because Delphi was also a center for athletic contests every 4 years or so, pan-Hellenic agon, part of a big cycle of such contests. And so here the Athenians were telling the world that they had the wealth to construct such a handsome building in such a prominent location in the most significant, symbolically significant Hellenic site in all Hellas. Why? Well, in a word, marathon. So some few years before this was put up sometime in the 480s. The Athenians, together with their much smaller little city Plataea allies, Plataea supplied perhaps 600 or so heavy armed infantrymen, the Athenians 9,000, our main source is Herodotus. Great conflict took place on the battlefield of Marathon in 490 BC. An invasion had been launched from Persia by sea, because the Athenians, together with the Eretrians on the island of Euboea, had had the temerity to support a revolt against the mighty Persian Empire. This empire had been founded originally middle of the 6th century BC by Cyrus, Kurash in Persian, Kuros in Greek, Cyrus in Latin, founded in Iran, southern Iran actually, and they did very quickly spread. It was the fastest growing Oriental empire to that date, and it engulfed everything from as far west as the Aegean seaboard and as far east eventually as what's today the Indus Valley, Kashmir, Pakistan, that bit of northwest India. And it incorporated, therefore, quite a few Greek cities. And they, after about 20 odd years of being subjects of Persia, to 40 years of being subjects of Persia, they rose up and revolted. Complicated story. They asked their mainland cousins, as it were, please help us. And only 2 cities responded positively. One of them was Eretria, as I mentioned. The other was Athens. Well, in about 498, the Athenians committed what the Persian regime regarded as sacrilege. They advanced as far as Sardis, a Lydian city, one of the vice-regal capitals of the Persian Empire in the west. And they, set fire to quite a lot of the city of Sardis, including a temple of Cybele, the Magna Mater, as the Romans later called her. And that the Persians deemed to be cause sufficient for retribution. They had another motive, of course, not purely retribution. They wanted to make sure that no Greek from outside the empire, no Greek city, ever again interfered in their sphere. Herodotus tells us the Persians considered all Asia to be theirs. So anybody beyond the frontier of geographically Asia was outside their empire in principle, until and unless they extended their empire in the northern Aegean to include Macedonia, part of Bulgaria today, part of northern Greece today. And that was the situation when, and it was just a matter of time before, the Persians launched what I've called the biggest armada, amphibious invasion by land and sea in the late 480s, in fact, finally in 480. So the Athenians and other Greeks, of course, the Athenians knew they were going to be #1 target, had a good deal of time to prepare for this massive invasion. That's not always a good thing if you have a lot of time. It can be, but in this case, as we'll see, it was somewhat controversial. During the 480s, beginning in 4887, Athens, a fledgling democracy, had introduced a number of ways in which it, first of all, chose its leaders, then secondly, checked on its leaders, then made its policy decisions, and then checked and rechecked its policy decisions, very often in a very personal way, such that a policy would be identified with a particular politician and wouldn't have an independent validity. There are no political parties in this early democratic Athens. And one of the, well, to us it's quite puzzling, but to them much more understandable ways of doing direct democracy involving votes by anybody who wished, who was entitled, in other words, any Athenian citizen. One of their most democratic ways of doing politics was through a, to us, strange institution. We call it ostracism, and we call it ostracism because it's from the Greek word ostrakon, which means a potsherd, of which you see an example on the screen in front of you. Now, the sources, that is the evidence for the way the procedure was conducted, how were the votes counted, how many votes were required, was there a simple majority against a particular candidate, or did there need to be a minimum quota of all votes cast and then the votes were tallied against individuals, whatever. It's a kind of reverse election. So whoever gets the most negative votes is obliged by law to exile himself without losing his citizen status, without being deprived of his property. So he's not a criminal, but he's obliged to exile himself beyond the frontiers of the state of Athens, Athenae, for 10 years. Well, Harold Wilson, some of you will remember him as Labour Prime Minister back in the 60s and 70s, said a week is a long time in politics. 10 years was a lifetime, or at least it could be. So, candidates for ostracism in the 480s BC, following the Battle of Marathon, knowing the Persians are going to come back, that was the big issue. We're in other words, the equivalent of the 1930s in Britain. What attitude should a politician take towards, in this case, Persia, in that case, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany? And so throughout the 480s, there was a series of ostracophoriae, bearing literally of ostraca, held in succession. Every year, the assembly, at a particular time of year, anybody who wished could pitch up to the assembly on the Pnyx, was asked, do you wish to hold an ostracism this year? And let's suppose things were heated, and boy, I imagine they're getting very heated, a little bit of a cooling off period. If they voted in a majority by raising their right hands for an ostracophoria that year, then a few months later it was held. So tempers might somewhat have cooled, or they might, as in the American presidential election going on right now, they might have heated even further as the run-up to the actual day of turning up and voting occurred. So here we are in front of you. I'm just showing you one, Aristides Lysimachou in the genitive. Aristides, son of Lysimachus. Well, he actually got the boot. In other words, he was felt to be not sufficiently the right sort of leadership material in the coming crisis of a Persian invasion. There's, of course, a funny story about him, an illiterate, rustic voter. He knows there's going to be an ostracophoria. He's very keen to do his democratic duty. He pitches up, but unfortunately, he's illiterate. The story, by the way, is in Plutarch. It's not in a more recent, a more timely source. And he asked the nearest looking sort of august gentleman, in other words, the sort of guy you'd think would know what was going on. Excuse me, sir, I'm illiterate, but I want to vote. And so could you please scratch on, here's the potsherd, which I've got for you to scratch on. And so he gives the potsherd over, and the relatively august figure asks, and whose name would you like me to inscribe? Aristides, son of Lysimachus. Whereupon Aristides, who clearly was a decent sort of cove, he doesn't take offense. He says, but what has Aristides ever done against you? Notice it's personalized, as opposed to what policy is it of Aristides that you disagree with? So the illiterate peasant says, because I'm fed up to the back teeth with hearing him called the just. Well, that's another story. Why did he acquire that nickname? So anyway, Aristides writes it, and that's a democracy in action, absolutely as it should be, no fear or favor, and all very decent and above board and so on. Anyway, Aristides was out, but as the crisis developed, as in fact the climax of the crisis occurred in 480, all those whom the Athenians had ostracized in the previous 7 or 8 years were recalled, including Aristides. Against Aristides, and in fact against all those who were ostracized, so a man who had, by definition, the ear and the majority support of ordinary Athenian voters, is the gentleman, if he was a gentleman, that I put on the screen here. 3 examples out of thousands. There are more recovered ostraca against Themistocles, as he's spelt here, Themistocles on the left, but Themistocles in the middle, Themistocles is on the right, son of Neocles. And then on the right-hand one, the guy has added his deme. There are about 140 demes. You become a citizen by becoming a member of a deme. And his deme was Phrearoi, so he's Phrearios in the genitive, or in the nominative case here. So these come from a well, as I said on the caption, and we think the date is 482 BC. This is just after the critical vote in the assembly as to what the Athenians should do when they had suddenly received a major bonus surplus strike of silver in the lead. It's actually silver-bearing lead mines in southeast Attica, in Lavrion. Had the sum of money raised that year, in terms of rent, from the lessees, the people who'd hired the right from the state to excavate silver, and then they had to hand over a certain amount. Well, had that sum that year been distributed to every single citizen, of whom there were about 25, 30,000 maybe, they would each have got a certain, not inconsiderable, but not ginormous. They wouldn't all have become millionaires, but it's like winning the lottery and distributing it amongst the entire population, as opposed to just keeping the dividend for yourself. Against that proposal, Themistocles advocated a statesmanlike use of the money in a military and then by implication imperial manner. And not just imperial, but also democratic. Because he said, look, with this money, we can build a serious fleet of trireme warships, the latest model ships of the line, the 170 oarsmen, 200 crew altogether, glorified racing eights, the sort of ships that actually fought and won the Battle of Salamis 2 to 3 years later in September 480 BC. He got the majority vote for that. And so the Athenians did indeed build up by far the largest fleet of any single Greek city, such that when it came to the crunch, when the Persians were seriously building up their forces and armaments in 481 BC, and those Greek cities who were willing and able were brave enough to consider resistance, amongst them, Athens had by far the largest fleet to offer. However, and this now is for my fellow Spartans, the overall leader of the very, very tiny loyalist Greek resistance, 30 plus cities out of 700 in Aegean Greece, only 32, 33. At any rate, the Spartans had allies and they had their own alliance, and they had more than half of those 30-odd original sworn resisting allies. So Sparta provided the generals on land, Sparta provided the overall admiral-in-chief at sea, even though at Salamis, Sparta, which is by definition a land-loving power, if anybody's been to Sparta, it's quite a ways from the sea, they therefore were providing every viadas or Eurybiadas. He was actually the overall commander. He was, as it were, the Wellington of the ship. I won't call him the Nelson, because Nelson wasn't the admiral of the fleet in every battle that he won, but he played nothing like a role, anything like Nelson, of course. At any rate, let me move on from the situation. I've tried to paint the picture, but there is one element which I must now add. If you place your principal force, your major military arm on the sea in an ancient Greek context, the principal burden of the actual fighting falls on those men who row the ships, and of course those who immediately command them, the helmsman, the guy who beats the time or plays the time, and there are a few. The engine room is the rowers. So what Themistocles, by committing Athens to a principally naval future, despite Marathon, a victory of the heavy armed infantrymen who were the relatively much more wealthy element in the citizen body, the top 1/3 or so. Themistocles gave a huge fillip to the political clout, not just the military, the political clout of ordinary members of the demos. And I mentioned earlier that demos has this ambiguous sense. It can mean the people as a whole, all the citizens, Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg, government of the people, by the people, for the people. But it can also mean the masses in the sense of the poor masses, most of whom cannot afford hoplite equipment, let alone cavalry equipment, a horse and so on. And so it is the demos in that sense that win the Battle of Salamis. Now, of course, Salamis wasn't the end of the Greco-Persian Wars. I hasten to remind people that though it was absolutely necessary victory, had the united loyalist Greeks lost, that would have been it. But it was not a sufficient victory. Xerxes retreated to Persia via the Hellespont, Dardanelles, and you could say with his tail between his legs. But he left behind a very sizable land force under the command of the man who, if you believe Herodotus, was actually among the Persian elite nobility, the prime mover of the entire anti-Greek expedition, namely Mardonius. So I've written a book about this. Of course, Plataea is the decisive land battle of the Greco-Persian Wars between 490 and 479. It takes place in 479. And that is a principally Spartan victory. And thereafter, there's a kind of ding-dong. Sparta says, we won the war, as it were. But for us, there would have been no defense at Thermopylae. Admittedly, it was a defeat, but we lost a king. We sacrificed a king for the good of Hellas. And we bought time, vital time, for the forces to foregather at Salamis when the Persians had already occupied Athens and destroyed the predecessor of the building you see on the screen, among much else. And then, therefore, we deserve to be called the saviors of Greece. Oh no, said the Athenians. And they had a very powerful advocate. It's one of the few things on which I differ from my history hero, Herodotus. Herodotus said, no, it was the Athenians that were the soteres, tis Hellas, of Hellas, because of Salamis. And as I say, but for Salamis, no continued resistance, end of the Persian War. And well, this is what we historians argue about, and perhaps we're going to get some interesting comments from my listeners. What would have happened to Athenian democracy? What would have happened to the development, what's often called the Golden Age, rather like Renaissance Florence, the mid-5th, later 5th century BC Athens, a kind of astonishing flowering of high culture. Pericles, the great statesman, but also a great character in Thucydides, is given not 2 but 3 speeches, quite exceptionally in Thucydides, one of them being the famous, the funeral speech. And in the funeral speech, I don't know whether he actually uses the phrase, but Thucydides credits him with the phrase that Athens is the paideusis, and then again of all Hellas, the process of education. It's often translated school, but I think it should be more university or even research institute of all Greece. At any rate, what you see on the screen is one of, in a way, Athens's major arguments in the post-Persian Wars debate about who most deserves credit for saving Hellas from the Persian barbarian in 480-479. It's not the first such statement. That actually comes in our earliest source, written source, surviving written source of any length for the Battle of Salamis, and that, as you all know, is Aeschylus in his Persians, one of a trilogy which was put on in 472, sponsored by, in other words, the chorus and various other bits and pieces were paid for by Pericles. Age 20, well, I see there a distinct linkage. Pericles sponsors Aeschylus's Percy because Aeschylus's Percy gives a very favorable spin to a particular Athenian. He can't mention him because that's against the convention of drama, tragic drama, namely Themistocles. So there's a kind of progression from Themistocles, the architect of Athens's naval policy, followed by Aeschylus, who fought at Marathon, probably was near the battle at Salamis without being actually on a ship, and then Pericles, who, well, here we go, Pericles and the Parthenon. Some people speak of Periclean Athens. That's, I think, to go wildly too far. Some people even speak of Periclean Greece, as if that whole huge Hellas with its 1,000 cities was somehow to be identified and equated with or downsized to the level of one of the cities and one of that city's politicians, Pericles. But there's no question that Pericles, for all the many other things he did, including commanding fleets into the Black Sea, incidentally. I mean, he's no slouch as a commander, but he's not particularly famous as the Nelson of Athens. But one of the things that he's very intimately associated with is the so-called building program. Plutarch, a very much later source, preserves possibly contemporary, possibly from a comic play. Comic writers were very hostile to Pericles, and we tend to think Pericles must have had a good press. Well, actually, no, he had a mixed press. Anyway, Pericles was accused of decking Athens out like a prostitute. And of course, prostitutes, or at least as then the profession was practiced, were thought probably to put on too much makeup, to exaggerate the external rather than, and so on and so on. So in other words, the Parthenon and the rest of the Acropolis building complex, the building program, and the building program in the Agora, the civic centre below the Acropolis, very much associated with Pericles, one of the commissioners, the epistatai, who kept tabs on the expenditure, which came partly from tribute from allies, but also largely from internal revenues. The Athenians generated internally a great deal of revenue anyway. And I mentioned already the fees you had to pay if you want to mine silver. Well, that's just one. Court fees. There are fines, and so on and so on, all sorts of ways. So the Athenian treasury, which incidentally, in due course, was placed in this building, the Parthenon. This was an extremely both expensive but symbolically terrifically important project. We call it the Parthenon. In antiquity, that was the name only of the internal bit, the building where the cult statue of Athena the Virgin was. The cellar, as we sometimes call it, or the sikos in Greek. Parthenon is a modern term, but of course it's terrifically evocative. Well, I'm going to end now with one more slide, and this is not of, well, Parthenon's off to the left, but the point of this is that from the Acropolis, and actually more particularly directly through the middle of the Propylaea, which is the monumental Pentelic marble gateway, I mean, never completed, vast project just to build this entranceway to the Acropolis in the 430s. The Parthenon was built between 447 and 432. Point of this slide, a lithograph from the 1820s or 30s by Charles Brockdorff, is to show the intervisibility and the symbolic as well as physical intervisibility of the Acropolis, the Parthenon, built on top of the ruins that the Persians had created sacrilegiously in 480 and again in 479, between the Parthenon on its Acropolis and Salamis down there in the Strait. So of course that's not the end of the story of democracy, but the Parthenon, in terms of its origins, in terms of its positioning, in terms of its funding, in terms of its management, in all these ways was an utterly, as well as imperialistic, democratic building. And the Athenian democracy has, of course, a long and complex history, which continues. There are actually 2 or 3 more variations of democracy between the Persian Wars and the slide I showed you right at the beginning, the stele, the pillar of the law against tyranny in 336. But if you have been, thank you so much for listening, and I hand back to James.
Brilliant, thank you very much for that, Paul. We've had a few questions come in through the Q&A, so I guess we can start off with those. So one of those is regarding the possible influence of the Battle of Salamis on the development of the kind of Athenian politics and regime more generally. Did contemporary or later writers voice an opinion regarding this influence? So I suppose, did later writers write about the impact of Salamis on Athenian democracy?
Yes, there is one writer, and I'm sure some of you will immediately think who it might well have been, and it was in fact Plato. Plato, thoroughly Athenian, aristocrat, terrifically well-born, intimately connected to various political circles, but political circles that were going to prove massively controversial because they would eventually get themselves involved in what was called a dynasteia, a collective tyranny, the so-called 30 tyrants led by a maternal relative of Plato called Critias or Critias, who was a raving fan of or at least as he perceived them, things Spartan. Well, Plato had quite a long writing career, starting in the 380s, going on to the 340s. And his last work, which seems to have taken some 20 years, the Laws, the Nomoi, has three interlocutors, a Spartan, a Cretan, and an Athenian stranger. And the stranger is often thought to be a kind of surrogate for Plato. Well, amongst other topics raised, one is, well, what sort of a polity, this ideal utopian polity that we are in words constructing, and we're intending it to be somewhere in central Crete, that's a homage to one of the three interlocutors. What sort of a polity will it be? Will it involve itself in war? Will it be anywhere near the sea? Oh no. They agree that's very, very dangerous, you see, because trade, commerce, brings in all sorts of terrible values like cheating and, wrongly valued commercial material gain over spiritual self-development and so on. But in terms of pragmatics, in terms of warfare, naval warfare is thoroughly inferior to land warfare. Let me give you one instance. Plato makes one of his interlocutors say, when a hoplite is facing his enemy, hand-to-hand fighting, phalanx fighting, they meet face to face, they look at each other. When a sailor rowing a trarry advances against the enemy, he's looking away from the enemy, not at his enemy. How cowardly can you get? And secondly, these ships, they don't advance in a straight line abreast and, in good order, but they're here, there and everywhere, and they can back water as a proper tactic. Well, how disgracefully cowardly. It's almost laughable, and I'm almost laughing, but the point is that Plato understood absolutely the intimate connection, and he passed it on to his best pupil, Aristotle, who says the same sorts of thing at considerable length in his Politics. The sort of armament, the type of fighting that dominates, that is, in other words, most responsible for either increasing the power of a state or maintaining the power of a state, especially its actual farmlands, that group typically acquires and holds the bulk, the majority of power, giving rise to the different sorts of regime, cavalry, aristocracy, hoplites, a kind of broad oligarchy, naval warfare, democracy, horrors.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Kind of following on from thinking about democracy and naval warfare, we have one question here asking, given the importance, particularly at Salamis and more generally of naval warfare in Athens, why don't we see any sea battles depicted in Athenian art?
Yes, it's a good question, but in a way it's because it's exceptionally difficult to find the medium. We have very, very few panel paintings or even fresco paintings from classical Greece. If you go to Santorini, which is modern, the modern term, Venetian term actually, but for Thera originally, go back to the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, to the prehistoric period, late Minoan, early Mycenaean. There are frescoes of fleets. Amazing, not actually in sort of dire action face to face with sailors catapulted off the decks and blood running and all that, as really would have happened in a sea battle. Come down into the early, very early historical period, or if you like, the late Dark Ages, what's sometimes called the geometric period. Then you do find on what was then the medium of choice, a very large, either craters, which are wine mixing bowls, or amphorae, which are transport vessels made of clay and painted almost to death on the outside, literally including death. Well, you do get sea battles depicted there on those. And indeed, that might allude to the fact that the occupant, the ashes within the crater or amphora, are those of a heroic Athenian who had died fighting in a naval battle. But you don't get very much in the way of depictions of sea battles at all in the classical period. There are exceptions. So-called Le Normand relief from the Athenian Acropolis depicts part of a crew of a triary. There are red figure vases depicting Athena, the great goddess. Of course, there are many different Athenae. There's Athena Parthenos, but the Athena of the city is Athena Polias. She is the most important Athena in terms of political power and religion in that sense. Well, there are images of her on fragmentary pots, which of course have to be preserved. So they typically come from tombs, any such painted pots, showing her holding the stern piece of a triary. They're called aphlasta. So that's a sort of allusion to Athens and the sea via Athena, our patron goddess, to whom, of course, we pray. And after victory, Athena Nike, Athena of victory, who also gets a temple on the Acropolis eventually, we sacrifice and we pray and so on. In the 4th century, there is a gravestone of a marine looking, one of those relatively few heavy-armed fighters up on the deck when a ship was boarded or resisting the attempt to board by another ship. And he looks extremely sad indeed. He's on the upturned keel of a triary. But you're quite right. There are no, to my knowledge, depictions of sea battles as such in 5th or 4th century BC Athenian public or private art.
Interesting. Perhaps connected to how pottery and who was using the pottery compared to who was rowing the ships, maybe.
Well, let me just give a supplementary. In the 460s, when Cimon, who was the son of Miltiades of Marathon, but who actually was the leading admiral in the 470s and 460s, in fact, down into the 450s, but he was ostracized because he was considered too right-wing at one point. Anyway, Cimon was a man of considerable versatility. And in his pomp in the 460s, a stoa, it's known precisely as the painted stoa, the stoa poikili in the Agora, was decorated with large panel paintings by some of the greatest artists of the day, and there is not a depiction there of Salamis. Instead, there is a depiction of a battle which we moderns struggle to try to discover, to determine which is the battle referred to, Battle of Inoe. So it's described for us by Pausanias, the man who traveled all around Greece. He came from Asia Minor, and in the 150s, 160s of the 2nd century AD, he became kind of pilgrim, and he went around Greece recording what he could see, with a special emphasis on anything pre-Roman, before the Roman conquest of the middle of the 2nd century BC. And so we owe a description of what was in the Stoa Poikili to him.
Brilliant. We've got a few more questions here. One of these, which has a couple of upvotes, is what other influential aspects of Athenians' culture survived or perhaps blossomed most after and perhaps as a result of the Persian Wars?
Right, well, the Athenians, as my colleague Simon Goldhill once called it, the city of words. And so words in the form of poetry, in the form of dramatic poetry, utterly fantastic. I mentioned Aeschylus's Persae, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, and these art forms had, in the case of tragedy, preceded the Greco-Persian Wars. Whether they would have succeeded the Greco-Persian Wars had Athens lost is more parlous, partly because drama at Athens was a central civic festival. The very first thing that the newly appointed eponymous archon, the man who gave his name to the civil year, so such and such happened in the year of X, that's how they dated events. The very first thing he did was choose the playwrights who were going to have their 3 tragedies, 1 satyr drama performed in the ensuing spring at the great Dionysia, the great or city Dionysia festival. So drama. Secondly, rhetoric. Because of the importance of persuasive speech, one comic poet said of Pericles that persuasion Pytho sat upon his lips. I think it's a lovely phrase. Because of the importance of the ability to address a very large audience in the open air, and to address a much smaller, but to our way of thinking, 500 in the council, to persuade them to put something on the agenda of the assembly in the way that that person thought it should be put. If you're proposing a motion at the assembly or speaking to someone else's motion, or if you're accusing a political opponent in court, for all these reasons, rhetoric, the art of the rhetor, and the Athenian for a politician was a rhetor, rhetor kai politeuomenos. So that's the second major Athenian, peculiarly, contribution to world heritage culture, if you like. Athens also became, and this is Plato again, it's actually in his Protagoras dialogue, named after a sophist, so-called wise man from northern Greece, from Abdera. Protagoras is made to say that Athens has become the mansion house, the city hall, the protanion of Sophia. Sophia is wisdom, partly in intellectual sense, also in a can-do sense, a sort of craft sense. So all those sculptors and all those painters who were responsible for the amazing both paintings and all the artworks, the sculptures, the reliefs on the Athenian Acropolis, in the Athenian Agora, at Rhamnus, at Sunion, you name it. Fantastic development of hierotechnia, what the Greeks called handcraft skill. Now, they didn't typically value the people who were skilled. They thought of them as merely craftsmen, but they valued their craft so that Phidias was absolutely a leading figure in the Athenian polity. But because Athens was the town hall of wisdom, it attracted the biggest talents from all round the vast Hellenic world. Gorgias from Leontini, Protagoras and Dimokritos from Abdera, Anaxagoras from Clazomene, I could go on. It also was a great time, and of course terrible events. We're in a time of plague now. In Athens in 480, a great plague struck at the start of the Great Peloponnesian War. Well, that promoted, as you can imagine, a vast interest, on the one hand, in what you and I might call superstition, spells, but in the other hand, in medical technology and medical interpretation, medical science. And so the Hippocratic epidemics become a central text, because you want to know what your likely prognosis is if you get the first symptoms of a particular nosos. So I could go on. Music, the dithyramb. Every drama was accompanied by music. And so the Athenians developed one particular choral form of music, the dithyramb. They also developed, of course, Sophocles and all those guys were composers and choreographers, as well as dramatists and directors. It beggars the imagination. I'm utterly filled with astonishment, thavma, at what our Athenian forefathers, cultural forefathers, did for us.
I'll resist the urge to continue the discussions on music and drama, given my interests in that.
That's you, James. I fed that to you.
Thank you. So we've got time for probably one or two questions more, and the most popular one we've got in the Q&A at the moment is perhaps the most fun and one caused arguments against historians, perhaps. Who do you think was the better historian, Herodotus or Thucydides?
Well, it's apples and pears, isn't it? I mean, they were chalk and cheese. So if you're looking for inclusivity and you're looking for fun and you want what Thucydides called tomouthodes, the storytelling element, then your Herodotus is your man. And he is the pioneer of history as both story and as explanation, with a certain amount of divine apparatus, but yet enabling a certain secular humanistic interpretation of past events. And boy, his subject was absolutely huge. And later critics typically went for Herodotus partly because of his language, which is Homeric, it's prose, but it's a Homeric form of diction, and partly because of the subject, because the Greeks won against the Persians, or some Greeks won against the Persians, whereas Thucydides, lousy subject, civil war, very nasty, plagues, civil fighting, destruction, irreligion, you name it, you know, what a bad subject. And his writing, terribly crabbed, hard to understand. Dionysius of Halicarnassus said, I don't even know what this means. And he would cite a passage of Thucydides. So for myself, Thucydides is the laser-like interpreter, the analyst of political ideology. He doesn't go in for institutional history. Sadly, if only he told us more about how the council made its decisions, how the assembly made its, in all that stuff, but he doesn't. But he certainly gives you food for thought, and that's why he, Thucydides, unlike Herodotus, features not just on the curricula of naval academies and so on, but also in political theory classes. In other words, as if you were a kind of philosopher, and a philosopher of history as opposed to merely a writer of history. So I see very, very many wonderful things in both. I personally, on balance, would go back to Herodotus more often than to Thucydides, but they are both utterly wonderful.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. And on that kind of final historian showdown, I suppose, we'd probably best draw a close to the questions. So it falls to me, I suppose, to thank once again our speaker, Paul Cartledge, for such an illuminating talk on the Battle of Salamis and how closely it was intertwined with Athenian democracy, and to thank again Fiona Hara for organising tonight's Zoom webinar. So with that, we kind of bid you all farewell and good night, I suppose. Thank you.
Yes, goodbye, everybody.